I recently completed reviewing the 3 Eucharistic miracles that are covered in the first video that comes up when you YouTube search for Eucharistic Miracles. This video linked below. My 3 individual reviews are also linked down below, but this is a kind of meta video. See, I had 2 Catholic YouTubers reach out to me to weigh in on the situation: Kyle Whittington and Jimmy Akin. I want to share their input, make an apology, and then revisit the tier list to see if my further reflections have changed anything. Let's begin. We'll start with Lanciano. Catholic YouTuber Kyle Whittington shared a document with me that contained more information than I can find online prior to my publishing that Lanciano video. This article, called The Eucharistic Miracle of Lanciano, Historical, Theological, Scientific, and Photographic Documentation by Father Nicola Nostotim, contains a lot more information about the history of the relic at Lanciano. And it does somewhat shorten the 900-year gap if you trust the anonymous source from 1631. It should be noted that the narrative of the text is based upon an earlier written text of Sebastiano Rinaldi in 1611. In support of the validity and credibility of the record, there exists a marble inscription from 1636, presently found on the right-hand side of the Church of St. Francis before the Valseca Chapel. This epigraph announces the canonical recognition of the holy relics on February 17th, 1574 by Rodriguez Gaspier, Bishop of Lanciano and a man with a strong historical consciousness. It's from page 8. Additionally, Father Nostotim gives an explanation for why we might not have any earlier documentation. For the sake of completion, a point noted in the chronicle of the historian Fella needs to be taken into consideration. He claims to have received confidential information in 1620 from 2 friars, Antonio Scarpa and Angelo Ciro, to this effect. In 1560, 2 Basilian monks came to the convent of St. Francis. They stole from us a parchment codex written in Greek and in Latin, hidden between 2 tablets, which contained the complete narration of the Eucharistic miracle. This codex had been given to them to read one evening by the Franciscans, but they made off early the following morning, taking the manuscript with them. From page 9. 2 points need to be made here. First, it seems quite unlikely that the friars did not know the contents of the codex by heart. By repairing the damage, they were thus able to reproduce its substance and thereby mitigate its loss to posterity. Second, for this reason, it seems as if the narration of the event transmitted in its double version reproduces and conveys faithfully the historical truth of the extraordinary miracle. Those original codexes are now lost to history, which is why the earliest written account of the miracle is from 1631. And only references the miracle being spoken about as early as 1574. Father Nostotim then goes out on a limb and recounts a dialogue as recorded in the Patrology by Minga. To conclude, an important and significant detail is handed down to us by Minga in his documental work called Patrology on page 1428 in volume 149 of this work. We find the theological dialogue entitled The Truth of the Body and Blood of Christ in the Eucharist, which involves as partners a certain Guitmundo, Archbishop of Avicera, and an art expert named Rogerio. They both lived around the years 1000 and 1100 AD and belonged to the Benedictine order. Their debate has been divided into 3 volumes and was meant to confute Berengarius's heretical dissertations. The theological dialogue was intended to support and reaffirm the traditional and abiding Catholic doctrine of the real divine presence. At a particular point, the story of the Eucharistic miracle, which took place in Italy, was introduced to confirm the Catholic position. Guitmondo said that he had learned from his master Lanfranco, a person above any suspicion, what follows. In Italy, a priest, while celebrating Mass, noticed real human flesh on the altar and real human blood in the chalice. At that sight, he began trembling and refrained from consuming them. At once, he reported the unusual event to his bishop and sought his advice as to what should be done. The bishop, after convening a meeting with many other bishops, recorded of the miraculous event and decided to take delicate care of the chalice containing the flesh and blood. Eventually, everything was sealed at the center of the altar so that all would be perpetually preserved as extraordinary relics. At a first glance, this tale seems to relate to a miraculous event without any precise and explicit reference. However, given its historical period, about the 11th century, nothing can prevent us from seeing it as an implicit, genuine, and established relationship with the Eucharistic miracle of Lanciano, of which it sounds like the faithful echo. The Patrology is an enormous collection of the writings of the Church Fathers and other ecclesiastical writers, published by Jacques-Paul Minga between 1841 and 1855. So I'm not sure that I trust the recounting of a dialogue from 1100 from a book published in 1841. Perhaps Menga himself cites sources, but Father Nostertim does not beyond Menga anyway. Secondly, the miracle at Lanciano is super similar to the Mass of St. Gregory anyway. The Mass of St. Gregory refers to a story from the life of Pope St. Gregory I, in which the host turned into bleeding flesh when a woman from the congregation laughed out loud at Mass, saying that she didn't believe that the host was really the body and blood of Jesus Christ because she baked that bread herself. This would have occurred around the year 600 AD, and was certainly a more popular event than Lanciano. There is art made of the Mass of St. Gregory, like this painting from the 16th century, and like this sculpture from the 15th century. Lanciano was not the subject of any art, paintings, or sculptures, or anything prior to the 17th century, as far as I can tell. So I find it pretty unlikely that Menga's dialogue is referring to Lanciano, and far more likely that Menga's dialogue is referring to the Mass of St. Gregory. This paper does have a science section, but this is clearly a theological piece of writing, not a scientific one. One thing I wanted to highlight, though, is that the testing was done on less blood than I even thought. I see an initial sample weighing only 20 milligrams, and then a second sample weighing 318 milligrams. Combined, this is only 338 milligrams, which is less than the minimum blood volume for any blood test that I work with. Blood's density is essentially equal to water, so I can convert 338 milligrams to 0.338 milliliters. Take a look at this minimum blood volume per test reference sheet, linked below so that you can check the source. I'm a project manager in clinical trials, so I'm fairly familiar with minimum blood volumes. And seeing this size of the sample taken sets off the alarm bells in my brain when I see how little sample Dr. Lannoli was actually working with. You very well may be able to ascertain blood type with less. This link here actually asks for a full 6 mils of blood for adult blood typing, but that strikes me as way too conservative. They also say that they only need 0.5 mils for neonatal samples, and I bet that 0.5 mil would be enough for an adult in a pinch. The anatomic pathway of this paper was much better. The essay lists the dyes that Lannoli used in the sample preparation, and they include pictures, which are neat, but I'm no expert and can't weigh in much here. I thought it was interesting that some of the blood tests that they did came up negative for the presence of blood at all, but the paper does mention that the negative results conflict with the other results, which are positive, and the other tests are probably more accurate. Thank you, Kyle, for sharing this paper with me. The essay will be linked down below for anybody who wants to read it in full. I reached out to Jimmy Akin, too, after I posted that video, and Jimmy brought up some good points. I never really mentioned the continued examination in 1980. And Jimmy's right, I didn't. I wanted to bring it up in this video, but I didn't bring it up in my original video because I couldn't find much about it, and I still can't find much about it. The paper that Kyle shared with me does not cover the 1980 studies, probably because that paper was published in 1979. Jimmy suggested that I check out the book that he used as his main source on episode 220 of Jimmy Akin's Mysterious World, A Cardiologist Examines Jesus by Dr. Franco Serafini. I shared with Jimmy that in a very millennial way. I get super frustrated by a lack of online resources. I did dust off my library card, though, to see if my library had the book, and nope, no dice. Jimmy did share that the book is available on Kindle, but I do struggle with giving money to Catholic authors since I am opposed to the way that the Catholic Church discriminates against gay folks. If any Catholic wants to gift me that book, or frankly any Catholic book, feel free to reach out to me at thenontraditionalcatholic@gmail.com. And while we're on the topic of things not being included in Catholic sources, I want to move on to my second video, the Buenos Aires video, because I owe Jimmy Akin an apology. I'm going to play a clip from my Buenos Aires video where I included Jimmy Akin's Mysterious World episode 220 in my list of Catholic sources that did not mention that Dr. Zugaba was a religious author. And what's weird to me is that none of the Catholic sources that I looked at mentioned Dr. Zugaba being the author of a religious book. The original video doesn't mention it. The Jimmy Akin video does not mention it. Here's a video that I watched that is strictly about the Buenos Aires miracles that does not mention it. Here's an article from the Catholic National Register that doesn't mention it. And here's a Catholic pamphlet that doesn't mention it. There's a huge problem with my inclusion of Mysterious World episode 220, though. Jimmy Akin doesn't mention Dr. Zugaba at all. So it wouldn't be fair for me to include Jimmy Akin on that list of people who omitted the fact that Dr. Zugaba was a religious author. Jimmy, I apologize for my inclusion of your video on my list, and I'll be more cognizant of my flippant accusations in the future. And then Tixla. I don't have much to add here, though I do want to highlight something that may have been confusing. I noticed that various people called Dr. Ricardo Castañón Gomez by different names. Sometimes Dr. Castañón, sometimes Dr. Gomez, sometimes just Ricardo. That may have been confusing. But make no mistake, Dr. Ricardo Castañón Gomez from Tixla is the same as the Dr. Ricardo Castañón Gomez from Buenos Aires. And I think that I did highlight that Dr. Linoli was the same from Buenos Aires and from Lanciano, which means that these two people were involved in all three of the miracles that I spoke about, with their overlap occurring in Buenos Aires. I don't know if I can conclude anything from this other than the fact that it appears as if the investigators are purposefully searching out Catholic-friendly scientists, and since their work isn't peer-reviewed, this makes me a little bit skeptical of their findings. All right, with those corrections being made, let's go back to the tier list to see if I make any alterations. Upon further reflection, I have decided to upgrade Lanciano from B tier to A tier. That moves Tixla, Mexico down from A tier to B tier. There's a few reasons for that, and I've outlined those on the next slides. Based upon the paper that Kyle shared with me, let's take a look at the Lanciano timeline. We have the original event occurring sometime around 700, supposedly. Apparently, Minga's Petrology includes a dialogue in the year 1050 that references Lanciano. I don't believe that the dialogue in Minga's Petrology references Lanciano. I believe that it references the Mass of St. Gregory. For that reason, I am not counting the Petrology as evidence towards Lanciano. However, I think that the best evidence does come in at the canonical recognition by the Bishop of Lanciano in 1574, of which we don't have the original canonical recognition, but the anonymous retelling of 1631 does make reference to the canonical recognition in 1574. The monk heist of 1560, which is supposed to explain the lack of documentation prior to 1560, in my opinion, is not greatly attested, having only been discussed in the 1620s. So I'm not certain how much stock I put in the monk heist, but I am willing to adjust my timeline from 1631 back to 1560. And 1560 and 1574 hardly make a difference anyway. So in my original video, I was counting the total distance between the original event and then the first evidence as being around 930 years, the distance from 700 to 1631. But I am willing to amend that 930-year timeline down to only 860 years, stretching from the original event in 700 to the monk heist of 1560. Now, believe it or not, this change from the 930 years to the 860 years is not enough to actually bump Lanciano up by itself. But the testing in the journal article that I've seen has just been way higher quality than I originally imagined. And for that reason, I've gone ahead and highlighted the yes in the Lanciano Journal article bucket. That highlight just indicates that this was far better than I had originally thought at the time that I published that video. And for that reason, I am promoting Lanciano, and that means that I am demoting Tixla, but Buenos Aires still has S tier. And that about does it for the Eucharistic Miracles series. I'm planning on continuing the tier list. I'm going to start incorporating things like Marian apparitions, the Shroud of Turin, kind of whatever floats my boat. It's my channel. I can do what I want. But hey, if you're a Catholic and you think that I'm being too harsh on the Eucharistic Miracles, let me know. I am trying to approach this with as open a mind as I can, understanding that I'm definitely a biased source, but I think that I'm approaching it pretty fairly. And so any Catholic who wants to discuss, reach out to me, and I'm happy to have you on the channel to discuss. Well, with that, I'll close out this weird meta video with a, until next time.